I guess before we do anything else, so you want to just give me a general sense of what the thesis is of this article and why you wrote it?
Yeah. So my perspective on inequality and capitalism is it's a little different than Mr.
Hmm.
Peterson's, and I think we'll find out in some ways different from yours, which I think will be fun to explore. But my view is the sort of the core of capitalism, where there are private property rights and free enterprise, is a good thing, and that
Hmm.
it's a motivator. But that's only the sort of initial step, and it can get taken way too far. And the United States is a very good example of that, where in the same country, indeed on the same street, you have people worth $100 billion and families not knowing, where their next meal's coming from. And that's just pathologically insane for those two things to coexist. And there's also, in addition to inequality, there's also other really big problems that our sort of unfettered version of capitalism allows, like environmental degradation. You talked really nicely in the previous segment about exploiting workers in other countries. There's a really long list of regulations that I would support. I think you and I would be in agreement on, that should be imposed, that would be very forceful, serious regulation. But at its core, you do the entrepreneurial innovation of capitalism, subject to the right regulation, is actually a good thing.
Gotcha. Well, obviously that's the nub of the disagreement that we do have, but I want to just give people some sense of some of the information that you cite in the article. So we have here the gaps in income between upper income and middle and lower income households rising over time. You can see the dark green line for upper income. Upper income incomes going up between 1970 and 2018, while middle income goes down, and lower income more or less flatlines, maybe slightly down. We have here the incomes of the top 5% of earners since 1981. We've got household incomes since the Great Recession, but we've got we have the wealth of U.S. families since the Great Recession. This one is labeled the richest families are the only group to have gained wealth since the Great Recession. And then we've got the ratio of income at the 90th percentile to income at the 10th percentile from 1980, when it's 9.1, 1990, 10.1, 2000, 10.6, 2010, 11.7, 2018, 12.6. And we've got this showing that this is the highest gap among the G7 countries: the US, UK, Italy, Japan, Canada, Germany, France. So that's the stuff. Those are pulled straight from your article. When earlier today, when I posted that I was going to have this conversation, our friend Steve Paxton also had these really interesting graphs. These are for both the US and the UK. This first one is so the green line is the US, and the the green line is the UK, the purple is the US, but they're, roughly similar. So it's how people think that wealth is distributed. It's how they think it should be distributed, with a much narrower gap than how they think it is, and how wealth actually is objectively distributed with a much wider gap than what they think it is, right? So I think this is, this really brings us to the core of the point of agreement, which is that the kind of wealth inequality that exists in the U.S. Right now is really obscene. And then I guess I've been thinking about how to kind of get us to the part that we disagree on. And I think one way of doing that would be just kind of exploring, like, okay, look, if what we've got right now is really bad, then part of how we figure out what would count as okay, right, is to think about why it's so bad, right? So I mean, what's your, like, how would you answer that question? Like, philosophically, what's the, what would, like, why do you think this degree of income inequality is so problematic?
I think it's a lack of regulation. It's a lack of progressive taxation and confiscating excessive wealth. It's a lack of passing legislation that limits what companies can do, degrading the environment, exploiting foreign workers, et cetera, et cetera. I think that is really, in a foundational sense, one of the core purposes of government, in my view,
Mm-hmm.
is to take human ingenuity and prevent the excesses from occurring. And what we've done in this country is we've set up a system that allows the excesses to just run wild, where the regulation that's supposed to step in, and it's it's the third rail. You're not supposed to say the word, but I'm a huge believer in just redistribution. That's not happening. So I think it's actually, to me, a fairly easy answer of why we're here. Just a failure of government to do its job.
Right. So that's the story to say about how we got to this point. But I'm also curious about, when we're thinking about where we'd like to be,
Yeah.
as opposed to where we are right now, then part of what will help us figure out, where we want to be is to figure out, it's like, okay, not just why it happened, right, which is the story you just told me, right, but essentially why that's bad, right? Like in other words, you think, like, you would agree with me and disagree with, like, libertarians and conservatives that redistribution can be justified. So clearly, if you think at least some redistribution can be justified, there's something that's really bad about having inequality on this level. But I think figuring out, like, what the respects is in which it's bad, right, can help us figure out what would count as an acceptable alternative.
Yeah, that's a great question. To me, it's just harm.
Mm-hmm.
Human beings are being harmed. People in Haiti are forced into slave labor. People throughout the country don't have shelter. The environment is being plundered. Harm is being done. And at the most basic John Locke level of government, stepping in to prevent harm is what government's supposed to do. And they're not doing it. And so to me, that's sort of the essence.
Okay. So that's kind of a utilitarian reason for objecting to inequality. But I do want to try to drill down a little bit deeper on that, because if we think about, like, what the sort of nature of the harms is, then that can help us see, like, okay, well, what would be an alternative that we'd be satisfied with? Because, for example, right, like, to maybe try to be clearer about what I'm asking here, like, one way of objecting to the kind of distribution of wealth we have right now is just that the floor is too low, right? So I'd say, okay, the problem, the sort of sufficientarian kind of critique of really existing wealth inequality, that you'd say, okay, the problem isn't really the size of the gap. The problem is just that that the people at the bottom don't have enough, and that like, that's really what we should be focused on. And then, like, kind of what the gap is once we fix that is sort of like, well, it could be whatever, whatever it is fine, right, as long as the floor is whatever we've determined is sufficient, right? That'd be one view. But then another view is that, okay, sure, obviously, if the floor is set at a place that causes a lot of suffering, that's really bad. But the size of the gap between the floor and the ceiling could also be important in and of itself, right? Like in other words, even if you hypothetically, right, obviously this wouldn't describe the society we actually live in, but even if you hypothetically had a floor that wouldn't really, correspond to what we think we'd like really think of right now as poverty, that it would be a problem if, some people were at that floor and then other people were, like at some level that was like 500 times that. And, I could certainly get into why I would see that as a problem, but just in terms of exploring where you're coming from, I'd be curious whether and why you would see that as a problem. Does that make sense? Do you see what I'm asking?
It does. Yes.
Yeah.
I think too big of a gap is a problem in itself.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's something sort of searing about the notion of a group of people being just above okay and another group of people, taking spaceships on date night, which is like happening. And Bezos doesn't just doesn't just have a spaceship. He has an entire company minting spaceships just with his little side cash, a few percent of his wealth. So I think when a gap's too extreme, that in itself crosses a moral boundary. But I also think, a place where I like to return to with this. Oh, did you want to say something?
No, go on.
A place I like to return to this, I think, is very relevant to the gap between ceiling and floor, is keeping an eye on the motivation of the people on the ground in the economy. I think it is, again, a good thing to have lots of people waking up excited to, start a successful company or be a leader in their organization and get rewarded for that. And so I don't mind some inequality if it helps motivate people, and human nature being what it is. I think there are not everybody, but I think there are a lot of people who are motivated by that, and that society benefits. Now, it also, if you're inventing a new way to do fracking, society might suffer. But on the whole, the innovations tend to be good. But once it crosses a certain threshold, which is way below the threshold it is now of wealth, those incentives essentially disappear. Jeff Bezos would have been just as motivated to do everything he did with Amazon if he made 1 billion instead of 300 billion. And it's that excess where the motivating factor completely disappears, and you're just hoarding enormous amounts of capital when people are, far below you. That's another real important focus for me.
Gotcha. So like there's a point in the article where you say, and importantly, there's nothing necessarily wrong with some people getting rich. A relatively large amount of inequality should even be encouraged. Hard work and ingenuity should be rewarded. As wealth first needs to be created before it can be redistributed. And business success stories motivate others to innovate and take risks that improve society at large. Innovation would plummet if entrepreneurs had severe caps on their income. And I think that this is really going to get us into the area of actual disagreement, right? So,
Great.
and I think one way of getting to that is to maybe try to disentangle the two things that I think, correct me if I'm wrong, are going on with your claim, right? One of them, you say there's nothing necessarily wrong with some people getting rich. And in the next sentence, you use the phrase a relatively large amount of inequality. So it seems like your view is that if you have, again, relatively large, so presumably, somewhere well under the kinds of gaps that exist in the United States in 2024. But, I don't know, like if you go back to, the 1950s, maybe the average CEO was only making like 10 or 20 times or something the income of the average worker, not hundreds of times the income of the average worker. And so I assume that like when you say a relatively large amount of inequality, you're talking about something more like that level of inequality as opposed to what we have right now. Please correct me if I'm misunderstanding that.
Certainly a lot closer to that than what we have now.
Right.
The key line, and it
Sure.
requires context, is again, where does the motivation sort of fall apart? And you don't even have to make 10 times, I think, to get there. But yes,
sure. So this is the thing that I find interesting, because there are two questions here. So you say there's nothing necessarily wrong with a relatively large amount of inequality, and then you go to the reasons why that could actually be socially beneficial. But just as a kind of starting point here, it does seem to me that those two claims can be disentangled. In other words, it could very well be that there is something that's innately wrong with relatively large amounts of inequality, but it has this kind of utilitarian benefit that's so good that it's like worth it, right? Like in other words, it could be that it's a necessary evil. And if that's the view, then
that's the view.
Okay, that's the view. All right.
That is a good way of articulating it. To me, if something nets out better, even if there are elements within it you prefer different, then it nets out better. And sort of from a John Rawls veil of ignorance perspective, put the veil up and set society up the way you want. I think to optimize things, the absolute best way for everybody, by driving innovation. And look at us right now, we're on a computer, there's the internet, where it's a lot of fun. This didn't just grow out of the air. You would want to set society up before you lifted the veil of ignorance to have some of that inequality. But if it wasn't for the motivating factor, all human beings are equal. Everyone's equal, and I wouldn't want any inequality, if that dynamic wasn't there.
Okay, so two initial thoughts about that. The first is about the example about the internet and computers and all of that. And I would point out, right, that quite a bit of that comes from innovation that actually happened in the public sector, right? I mean, the internet, originally comes out of ARPANET, at the Defense Department. If you ever watch Mariana Mazzucato, I think I got her name correct. She wrote a book called The Entrepreneurial State, and this is like the only TED Talk I'd ever recommend. But she does this thing at TED Talks where she'll like take out a smartphone and be like, "Look, this thing, everything that makes this thing smart, right, as opposed to an old dumb phone, is that the internet itself." The global positioning technology, the touch screen, right? All of these things, basically emerged from like public sector research labs, right? So that's just like an empirical point, that it's that the idea that we sort of need the private sector for technological innovation, I think at the very least strikes me as often like really overstated, given how much basic research actually is housed in the public sector. It sort of has to be housed in the public sector, because if you're doing basic research, you almost definitionally don't know whether it's going to pay off. So it's like really hard to justify in terms of like quarterly projections, spending a lot of resources on it.
I totally agree with everything you said. And the overstatements are absurd. The friend you were debating in the last segment would probably say something like that, where, the government, it's all private sector and government just taints everything. And that's ridiculous. Enormous developments and innovations have come from the government. To me, people are people. If a really smart, brilliant person shows up and innovates, if his paycheck comes from the government or from a company, it's the same person and he's innovating. What I think is abundantly clear empirically is the private sector has played a huge role. The government has also played a huge role. And if you were to have one and not the other, it would be worse off.
Right. Okay. So I do want to to return to that because I actually do think, right, like, and I want this to be really clear because I don't, you know, I'm much more interested in actually like getting clarity on the issue than sort of doing, you know, YouTube point scoring, right? And like, and I actually do think that what you're essentially giving me with that last comment, that look, we would just be worse off if you didn't have, you know, capitalist ownership relations and the private sector as part of the deal. You know, I think there are, even though I ultimately disagree, I think there are actually some pretty serious reasons to think that, and those need to be contended with, right? But I just want to go because I don't want it to get lost. You earlier you'd referenced John Rawls and the Veil of Ignorance. That, you know, Rawls says, okay, you want to know what counts as a just society. You know, essentially imagine yourself having to design it with all the information that you could possibly want about every subject except for, you know, who you're going to be, right? And he thinks that tells you, you know, what counts as justice. But, you know, I have to say, even there, I am a little bit sympathetic to the critique of that comes from one of my favorite philosophers, GTAA Cohen, who says this is you know, not exactly how he puts it, but I think this is roughly the idea, right? Well, look, if you even imagine yourself in that veil of ignorance situation, you know, your first thought, right, would be, well, okay, I want as equal a distribution as possible, right? You know, and or maybe like or well, yeah, give me just a second to, you know, to do this, right? So
yeah.
Or maybe like what Cohen says is that you should have that basically, you know, you wouldn't want unchosen inequalities, right? You know, that maybe you wouldn't object to, you know, different people just making different decisions and ending up with, you know, with different results. But if there's an inequality in distribution that's just totally outside of the control, right, of the people who get the short end of the stick, then if you thought you might be one of those people, right, you'd object to that. Now, granted, your second thought might be, oh, wait a second, maybe we'll have these bad economic effects if we don't, you know, if we don't let in some inequality, and so maybe inequality is okay if it ends up benefiting the people who are the worst off. That's Rawls's view, but Cohen's view is this is this conflates two different issues, right? Sort of one, what counts as justice, and the other one is, okay, once we need to sort of make pragmatic calculations and trade off justice against other values, including just sort of pragmatic efficiency, right? Then we might accept at a certain point in history, at least for a while we work on figuring out a way to eliminate even this, right? A certain amount of inequality. But at the very least, it's good to keep an eye on what's being traded away, right? As you make that trade, right? That you're losing something significant if you're still allowing in unchosen inequalities, right? That's the Cohen point. And if you go along with that, and maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't, maybe you'd have to think about it. That's all fine, right? But if you would go along with that, right, then I think that the question is, okay, if you go back to, you know, again, some point in the past where inequality, you know, economic inequality wasn't as bad, or maybe you look abroad and say, you know, I think one of your graphs we just looked at was the G7 nations, and say, hey, here are other countries in the world that they still basically have capitalism, but they don't have the degree of inequality that we do, right? So it seems like we can go, you know, we can go to a situation that's much more equal than we have without losing too much of that those gains in economic efficiency. Fair enough, but then the question is, okay, well, should we be satisfied with that, right? Or should we be trying to push towards something that's even better, right? Like, so, you know, should we be trying to push towards a form of sort of comprehensive socialism, not in the, Soviet sense, because it'd be more democratic, but, but certainly beyond just the Nordic model, right? Something that would actually be, real socialism. Should we be trying to push towards that? At least if we can figure out a way of doing it, without sort of unacceptable losses on the other end of the ledger. And it seems to me that there are basically two reasons that you might say no, right? One of them might be you actually think sort of social democratic capitalism, right? That kind of halfway house is fine, right? That's sort of good enough. And the other one might be that you could say, well, sure, I could see that this other thing might be better, but I just don't believe it's possible to have that without having unacceptable consequences. And I am curious, I guess, maybe you've already said this, but I mean, just to be clear, which one of those, or if there's like a third option that I'm not seeing, it would be your reason for saying social democratic capitalism is fine, it's good enough.
Well, I would be comfortable going quite far in the direction of redistribution. I hesitate to use socialism without us defining it, but I feel like that might take the full episode. So
let me see if I could do let me see if I can do a really quick version and then get your thoughts, right? So if socialism, right? So if capitalism is, and you kind of said this earlier, you're talking about, the private sector, entrepreneurship, all that stuff, right? So if capitalism is a system where, let's just use the old fashioned terminology, the means of production, right? The economic goods generating machinery of society, factories, farms, stores, Amazon distribution centers, right? All that stuff. That stuff is in the hands of private owners who aren't necessarily the people who are actually working there, but this class of capitalists, of private business owners, right? If that's what capitalism is, and if what socialism is it at minimum is social ownership of the means of production, that in some way or another, we don't have that class anymore. We have some form of collective ownership instead, whatever that looks like, right? If we kind of take that as a baseline definition, right? So my view would be that capitalism itself, even in the sort of better form of it, right? That looks more like Norway and less like the United States, is still, unacceptably inegalitarian in different ways we could get into. And that and so all else being equal, we'd be much better off, right? Moving towards, again, democratic, et cetera, but, form of socialism, then, is like, from everything you've been saying, like I was a little less clear on the Newsweek article, but from everything you've been saying in this conversation, it sounds like your reason for saying no would just be that you think that the effects on like economic efficiency would be too bad.
Correct. Yeah, I think if you go too far, I think we have enormous amount of room towards socialism as you define it, and I would support enormous amount of redistribution. I mean, I would take $200 billion from Elon Musk right now. I'd leave the poor chap with only like $1 billion. He'd be so. I mean, it'd be less, but enormous amount of redistribution, enormous amount of regulation. Right? It's not just the tax code, but it's laws that are enforced that prevent, profit-seeking activities from the private sector. But I wouldn't go all the way to giving the government control over the means of production. I think what you would have there is a reduction in a truly negative, harmful thing, standing alone, inequality. All human beings are equal, in my view. That's my premise. But I think what you would see there would be a reduction in productivity and innovation, strength. I think being strong as a country in the modern age is important too. You would just see a reduction in that realm that would be harmful and would harm the country as a whole. And so if you go too far to that extreme, it becomes a net negative. So that's my basic view. And the last thing I'll add is I do think the private sector plays a really important role. I think government plays an important role and has been a big part of the history of lots of our important innovations. But the private sector, I think, does do an enormous amount of R&D. It's a really well-known business model to throw lots of things at the wall and see what sticks. And when it sticks, then you run with it. And companies, big companies that do harm, also have huge R&D budgets in the billions of dollars, and they're innovating. So it's not, I don't think, I might have misheard you, and I want to give you a chance to correct it if I did, but I don't think it's a government function to do really core, innovative R&D. I'm starting to see driverless cars more and more here in Northern California. And I know that Google has been working on its driverless car subsidiary for like 15 years, and it's just now finally coming. And those often don't even work, right? Amazon created a phone that went extinct within a year, and I think spent billions on that. So to sum up, I think if you go too far, the net impact, you get rid of one problem of the inequality, but you create a host of new problems, and the net impact is negative.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I think as far as innovation goes, again, I think really quite a bit of basic research, right? So like fundamental breakthroughs that are then adapted. It's true, right? Like in the current system by private sector companies to like specific products. Does happen in the public sector. Again, all these things that make this a smartphone. This seems like a really powerful example, or
Well, I think
if you think about,
lots of private sector innovation in the smartphone, right? Or are you saying that's not?
Well,
that Apple didn't innovate, or what are you saying?
I think that Apple innovated. It's certainly considerably less than people tend to assume. I mean, if you think about the sort of most basic innovations that are built into it, right? The internet, the touch screen, global positioning system, right? None of these things, right, came out of the private sector. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a role that Apple's playing, was playing in, sort of taking those basic breakthroughs and translating it, into the sort of smartphone as we know it, right? Like they certainly did, but I think that is a really I think that how much of technological progress under capitalism does rely on the public sector is pretty significant when it comes to thinking about what a alternative might look like and what would or wouldn't actually realistically get lost in the change, right? So I think that if you think about why capitalist ownership structures themselves might be a problem beyond, the sort of failures of, government to do enough redistribution of the results, or to regulate, the bad practices enough, the sort of more fundamental problem, right? That, think like, okay, and I know this can feel a little silly because, we're so ludicrously far from achieving even this much in the United States that, it can feel a little bit like, I don't know, playing a game of pickup basketball and start saying exactly what I want to do when I make it to the NBA, right? But but if we did achieve that sort of Sweden level of redistribution and welfare state and regulatory state in the United States, you think about capitalism even as exists in Sweden. Well, with capitalist ownership structures in place, it seems to me that you have a few basic issues. One of them is about the issue that you've been focusing on, which is wealth distribution. That if the people who are actually owning the means of production are this, smaller subset of society, which they're going to be regardless. I mean, any kind of modern and industrial economy involves lots and lots of people working together, right? So if you have mostly private ownership structures, then you're going to get even if you have pretty robust trust busting or whatever, right? It's still going to be the vast majority of people are not going to be capitalists. They're going to be workers. So if you have this class of capitalists who are running the means of production, and then they're basically making the decision about how to distribute the result. And that can be counteracted to a certain extent by labor unions and regulation, right? But they are basically deciding how to divvy up the proceeds, and that, it seems to me, is a recipe for pretty much automatically getting a degree of distributive inequality that's going to be much worse than I think what can really be justified in terms of that idea that any sort of unchosen inequality, right, any kind of inequality that the person at the bottom end of couldn't do anything about, is going to be a problem. Right. So that's one issue about distributive equality. Another issue is about inequality of power. And in fact, I would argue that in some ways that's the more basic issue that inequality in distribution is downstream of. That, certainly in the workplace, if you have capitalist ownership relations, that means that the majority of the working age population is going to be spending half of their waking hours. If you have an 8-hour day and you sleep for 8 hours, right, that's half of your waking hours in a environment where you're being ordered around by people who have no democratic accountability to you, who you might have some sway over with the threat of quitting, especially if you're have rare skills. But even that is not that big a deal for most people, because it's just much easier for employers to replace employees under the overwhelming majority of circumstances than for employees to replace your jobs. So you have this kind of petty despotism that the people who are making decisions about the place where you spend half your waking life are unelected, and often they're out of sheer good luck. Whether it's the sort of most obvious forms, like you inherited the business from your dad, or I think less obvious but still very real forms of luck. And I think that's also going to extend to the political realm. That let's say you took away the however much you said you were going to take away from Elon Musk, the 200 billion from Elon Musk, it would still be the case, right, that the level of inequality in economic power between Musk and, say, workers at Tesla, even if he only had a couple of $2 billion or whatever, right, whatever he's left with at the end of this, right, that the fact that he controls all of those jobs, the fact that he has so much more, even in this hypothetical, he has so much more disposable money than any of those workers, means that look, if you're a line worker at Tesla and you try to call your senator, you're going to be very lucky if you get to speak to an intern, or if you get to speak to somebody with an actual staff job and not just an intern. Whereas I'm pretty sure if you're Elon Musk and you call your senator, you get to personally talk to your senator, because
the senator might not get to talk to Musk.
yeah, exactly. Right. So it seems like that degree of inequality in economic power is going to inevitably generate unacceptable differences in political power, right? So all of these seem like really good reasons to sort of object on a basic level to capitalist ownership relations. And I want to give your side of this your due, right? Because this is, I think, the sort of core point you keep coming back to. Say, okay, you could even accept all of that, saying, okay, yes, all else being equal, everything you've just said is a problem, but we need to have a flourishing economy, and so maybe it's just worth it in the ultimate exchange. And I would just say, well, let's not be too quick. I mean, if we could, we know that there are some things that the state can run just fine outside of the market entirely. A lot of these, I think we would agree on, right? Healthcare, for example, right? And so how about this, right? We can have, a form of socialism where things like healthcare and education, I would add, energy, transportation infrastructure, finance, right? So what socialists sometimes have called the commanding heights of the economy are under direct public control. And let's say that the sort of concerns that you're raising, this is obviously an empirical issue, it requires testing. I think there hasn't been nearly enough experimentation along these lines, but let's say for the sake of argument that the sort of problems about about innovation, even, which we were arguing about earlier, about incentives, about sort of coordinating production with fine-grained consumer preferences, all of those sorts of problems that people usually bring up in defense of capitalism. Let's say that means that we need some kind of private or quasi-private sector. It's like, okay, can we at least have that be a sector of worker-owned companies? Because if you have worker-owned cooperatives like, Mondragon in Spain is a particularly large and famous example of this, in the Basque Country of Spain, has like 80,000 worker members. If you have that, then you're just not, like you solved the inequality of power at work problem. You've solved a lot of the resulting political inequality problem. And certainly in terms of distributive inequality, look, even a worker cooperative might not have a 100% flat pay scale. People might vote to give some people, more income to entice them to take certain jobs, either because they're very demanding and they involve a lot of stress and responsibility, or because they're particularly dirty and dangerous jobs on the other end. But so you might not have a totally flat distributive scale, but come on, you're not going to have one guy who's going to live like Elon Musk and a bunch of other people who are going to live like Tesla workers.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of really big things, and I think you did a really good job articulating them. I agreed with a lot of what you said. I think from an empirical standpoint, I think, and this is a good thing, I think to note, I think our only real empirical disagreement so far, at least, I actually think the private sector has played a really significant role in the innovations. The government has too, but I think Apple did an enormous amount, I think, laying the pipes all around the world to create the internet, done by corporations. Empirically, I think we have a different sense of that relationship, and that probably drives some of our overall disagreement. As far as what you outlined, I think you sort of made this really good laundry list of problems with capitalism. I was just nodding, imbalances of political power and all hierarchies at work that are really unfair and can be very dehumanizing, and some of the worst abuses in the country are just a boss and their subordinate, right? There's protections, and there's a lot of robust protections, but they only go so far, and that can be a really unhappy place. And another thing I'd say is some of the most unhappy parts of hundreds of millions of people's lives is just work, going to work and having a boss and being in a hierarchy and not getting fulfillment out of that. So there's this huge critiques of capitalism that I think are correct. I just think, kind of the Churchill democracy quote, all forms of capitalism are terrible, except the alternative's worse. And I think if you were to move really strongly towards creating a system where there was much more government ownership and control, it wouldn't be, the cartoons you get from conservatives and libertarians wouldn't happen. But I do think you'd run into lots of problems. Elon Musk might not get the senator phone call, but different people would absorb power in different ways. And I don't think it would be, and I'm not suggesting you were saying it, but I think it would have its own sort of host of new problems. And the economy part of it to me is really, it's important. It's not, oh, let's have a flourishing economy and therefore I'll accept anything. I think the alternatives would not only harm the economy, but they'd have their own set of problems and their own set of challenges that, that we'd have to agree with. And so again, where does it net out? Wherever you are on the continuum here, in my view, lots of problems, lots of great things too, right? But I don't think if you just veer strongly towards socialism, you run away from a lot of big problems.
Yeah, look, if my if my task here was to convince you that there's a possible form of organizing society that leads to zero problems, I think
Yes,
that would be silly, right? But
yes.
but I think that without sort of suggesting that socialism will be a perfect utopia where nothing bad ever happens and the oceans are made of lemonade and all that, right? Like it still seems to me, right, that that the sort of basic imbalances of power, the what that does to democracy, what that does to how good a life people can have and give to their children if you have even 10 times as much wealth unchosen at the bottom and top, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, are all powerful enough problems with what we have right now that without having the illusion that the alternative is perfection, I think we should still keep trying to find an alternative, right? Because I do think this is really bad.
We both want an alternative. My alternative retains the core of the free market and free enterprise, but has a lot added on top to prevent these harms. And the alternative you want just eliminates that. So the question for you is,
sure.
what describe
sure.
like a really good socialist country that, and let's use a big one, the size of the United States and all the problems that come with our size and challenges.
Well,
like
if we
what
have
is that, what does that look like?
Okay, what does that look like? Okay, sorry. I'm actually glad you finished that sentence because I was slightly misunderstanding what you were saying. What does that look like, right? So yeah, I think that what it could possibly look like. I'd point out to Bhaskar Sankara, the editor of Jacobin, has a book from like 2019 called The Socialist Manifesto, where if you read just the first chapter of that book, right? I think he kind of lays out in a fairly vivid way what this could look like. But I think what it looks like is you take the things that we already have, pretty good reason to think can be run just fine, totally outside of the market. Again, healthcare, education, energy, the commanding heights. I think a lot of these experiments have already been run. And you take those outside of the market. I think if the primary mechanism for starting new firms was grants from publicly owned banks as a matter of policy, even if you did need some sort of private or quasi-private sector, again, I think you could at least have those made up of worker-owned firms to get that kind of workplace democracy component. I don't think that these elements have been combined in this way in the world yet. But one, I'd point out that even what you want at the scale of the United States hasn't quite happened yet. That this is something, in fact, that right-wingers will very frequently point out, that it's like, oh yeah, you can point to
tiny
Norway,
little Denmark,
yeah. These are like tiny little homogenous countries, and you think this will work in the United States, and so I think that your calculation correctly on that is okay, but there's no particular reason to think that the scale is means that that what can, work with
Yeah.
X number of millions of people can't work with, X times, 10 or 20 or 30 millions of people. And at the very least, we should try. And I would make similar points. And I would also point out that if it's true that we don't have we haven't had these, elements in that combination yet, like some of the individual components of the elements we actually have beta tested in the real world, that again, we have, we have, worker cooperatives that are as efficiently run as we'd want, like Mondragon. We have entirely state planned, healthcare systems, for example, have worked very well, et cetera. Right. So, a good number of the specific elements, have already been successfully beta tested. I think that combining them in this way and trying to go as far as I want to go, you're right, it hasn't been at this point in history. But I would just make, and I know we're running right up against time here, so I'm just going to say this and then kind of give you a chance to respond to it. And also feel free to plug your book while you're responding. But because I don't want to let you go without giving you a chance to do that, right? But but the sort of general methodological point that I want to make about this is, you're right. At this point in history, we haven't had that yet. But look, there was a time when you could say the same thing about political democracy, that, that's like, oh yeah, you can point to some city states or whatever, right? But, you don't have like political democracy implemented at any meaningful scale yet, right? There's a point where you could say that about the abolition of slavery, that it's like, oh, slavery has existed for every society that we know of for all the thousands of years that we know about. We've never had a complex society without it, right? That was true for quite a bit of human history, right? That, you could say the same thing about extending equality to women, that's like, oh, every society ever, has had these sort of different rights and responsibilities, the genders, et cetera. And so in general, it seems like a bad idea to say we haven't achieved some bit of progress yet at this point in history, therefore we never will, right? So that's where I'd want to kind of leave off on that. But I want to, we're at the hour, so I want to give you the last word and the substance of this, and then I want to let you plug your pluggables and call it a day.
Thank you. So, well put, Ben. Thank you. And I agree. The argument that it's never been done before, therefore it can't be done or shouldn't be done, or undercuts the idea that we should be trying it, is a terrible argument, and certainly not one I'm making. I was looking for your views on what it would look like, but not arguing that because it hasn't been done, it can't be. And I thought you made a really good point about the size of the United States cutting against any, we've never been this size, right, without the structure we have, and that's a terrible argument. I think a lot of agreement, and I think the fundamental view is private sector, public sector difference. I think a lot's flowing from that. I think the cooperative idea is probably better in theory than in practice, but I would just put that in the exact same category of public, private, and what the private sector can do and can't do. But all in all, I really appreciate your views. Very well thought out. And if the United States moved dramatically towards your view, we would both feel a lot better. If it went past mine, I'd want to pull it back a little bit, but we'd both be cheering if there was lots of movement. And I want to emphasize that in conclusion. As far as pluggables, I'll shamelessly plug my book, How America Works and Why It Doesn't. I do talk about these issues in the book, and it's a lot of the problems that we've talked about and that we've agreed about, are assessed in that book as part of why I don't think the country's working the way it's supposed to. So thank you. Appreciate your time.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/ Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.